Welcome to our continuing series, Questions and Answers for a World in Crisis. Today, Surrender, Part 4, from Sri Aurobindo. Question: Is it possible for a sadhak to reject all dharmas from the beginning of his sadhana? Sri Aurobindo: No, it takes time. But the will to surrender must be there. Question: What is the difference between active and passive surrender? Active surrender is when you associate your will with the divine will, reject what is not divine, assent to what is the divine. Passive surrender is when everything is left entirely to the divine. That few can really do, because in practice it turns out that you surrender to the lower nature under pretext of surrendering to the divine. Question: What is meant by detailed surrender, the flower which Mother sometimes gives? Sri Aurobindo: Surrender in every action and every detail of one's nature. Question: Is it true that until a sadhak's sincerity and surrender are complete, he has to undergo many sufferings? Sri Aurobindo: He need not suffer if he takes the true way, but he has to deal with the difficulties. Question: How long does the Purusha take to surrender completely to the divine? Sri Aurobindo: There is no fixed time. Question: How can one swiftly surrender the Purusha to the divine? Sri Aurobindo: By aspiration and by divine grace. The ways of the divine are not like those of the human mind, or according to our patterns, and it is impossible to judge them or lay down for him what he shall do or shall not do. For the divine knows better than we can know. If we admit the divine at all, both true reason and bhakti seem to me to be at one in demanding implicit faith and surrender. Not to impose one's mind and vital will on the divine, but to receive the divine's will and follow it is the true attitude of sadhana. Not to say, this is my right, want, claim, need, requirement, why do I not get it? But to give oneself, to surrender, and to receive with joy whatever the divine gives, not grieving or revolting, is the better way. Then what you receive will be the right thing for you. Faith, reliance upon God, surrender, and self-giving to the divine power are necessary and indispensable. But reliance upon God must not be made an excuse for indolence, weakness, and surrender to the impulses of the lower nature. It must go along with untiring aspiration and a persistent rejection of all that comes in the way of the divine truth. The surrender to the divine must not be turned into an excuse, a cloak or an occasion for surrender to one's own desires and lower movements, or to one's ego, or to some force of the ignorance and darkness that puts on a false appearance of the divine. To be entirely sincere means to desire the divine truth only, to surrender yourself more and more to the Divine Mother, to reject all personal demand and desire other than this one aspiration, to offer every action in life to the divine, and do it as the work given without bringing in the ego. This is the basis of the divine life. A complete surrender is not possible in so short a time. For a complete surrender means to cut the knot of the ego in each part of the being and offer it free and whole to the divine. The mind, the vital, the physical consciousness, and even each part of these in all its movements have one after the other to surrender separately, to give up their own way and to accept the way of the divine. But what one can do is to make from the beginning a central resolve and self-dedication, and to implement it in whatever way one finds open at each step, taking advantage of each occasion that offers itself to make the self-giving complete. A surrender in one direction makes others easier, more inevitable, but it does not of itself cut or loosen the other knots, and especially those which are very intimately bound up with the present personality and its most cherished formations, may often present great difficulties, even after the central will has been fixed and the first seals put on its resolve in practice. To be enjoyed by the divine is to be entirely surrendered, so that one feels the divine presence, power, light, ananda, possessing the whole being, rather than oneself possessing these things for one's own satisfaction. It is a much greater ecstasy to be thus surrendered and possessed by the divine than oneself to be the possessor. At the same time, by this surrender, there comes also a calm and happy mastery of self and nature. One has to aspire to the divine and surrender, and leave it to the divine to do what is true and right with the adhara once it is perfected. No surrender to the psychic being is demanded. The surrender is to the divine. Faith, reliance upon God, surrender, and self-giving to the divine power are necessary and indispensable. But reliance upon God must not be made an excuse for indolence, weakness, and surrender to the impulses of the lower nature. It must go along with untiring aspiration and a persistent rejection of all that comes in the way of the divine truth. The surrender to the divine must not be turned into an excuse, a cloak, or an occasion for surrender to one's own desires and lower movements, or to one's ego, or to some force of the ignorance and darkness that puts on a false appearance of the divine. They, faith, surrender, and samatha, have to be put into every part and atom of the being, so that there may be no possibility of a contrary vibration anywhere. Whether by tapasya or surrender does not matter. The one thing is to be firm in setting one's face to the goal. Once one has set one's feet on the way, how can one draw back from it to something inferior? If one keeps firm, falls do not matter. One rises up again and goes forward. If one is firm towards the goal, there can be, on the way to the divine, no eventual failure. And if there is something within you that drives, as surely there is, falterings or falls or failure of faith make no eventual difference. One has to go on till the struggle is over, and there is the straight and open and thornless way before us.